So last week we saw with this inflationary data coming in hot, we finally had the dollar breaking out of about a month-long slump. Is the bias for the greenback a winter surge in your opinion?
I think the dollar is going to remain quite firm. I mean, to be honest, it's been on the front foot really since the middle of the year, since around about June, and I think it's going to remain that case. Now, if we look at the different central banks, and of course we've got a lot of interesting central banks over the next few months, I think most people are of the view that, the Fed will be one of the first central banks to put interest rates up, and that move could be justified. So I think that's the sort of sentiment that's going to keep the dollar on the front foot. But of course, this week is going to be really interesting. We've seen that consumer sentiment index last week come in really, really weak. It's teaching us that not all inflation is equal, that the cost push does erode at demand. And this week we've got retail sales in the US. So I think that's going to really colour in some of this inflationary story.
Jane, good morning to you. Good to see you. That bullish dollar story, where is the most... well, let's start off with who takes the flesh wound and who takes the mortal wound? Who's your biggest offer out there? Take it away.
Well, it does depend on what sort of time frame that you're looking at. I mean, if we look at euro dollar, for instance, I mean, that's the main liquidity pair. I think we've got a lot of pretty good news in the price in terms of interest rate differentials from the central banks. Now, I think there will be volatility. There is some nice US data this week to focus on. There's quite a lot of Fed speak as well, so there will be volatility. But I do think that one will carry on being sold into rallies, and the dollar will gradually drift down, even if there are some pullbacks on the data in between. Cable, I think, is extremely interesting. That's come a long way, even though the market's thinking that the Bank of England could hike interest rates potentially as soon as December. I think there's a lot of concern regarding the UK that maybe the Bank of England could still be acting a little bit too soon. So, I still don't like cable very much, even at these sorts of levels.
Jane, you also mentioned volatility in these markets. Manus had a great chart to start the show talking about bond volatility, the MOV index. Well, we have certainly seen FX volatility pick up slightly, but at what point or can we expect that bond volatility to spill over into currencies?
Well, to be honest, the way I've been looking at volatility really for the last few years since the global financial crisis is that when we have that quantitative easing and an awful lot of policy accommodation, it's like a comfort blanket for the markets. It takes away some of the volatility, some of the fear, some of the risks when you've got so much cheap money. So once we're into an environment, which we're entering into now, where some of that safety blanket is going to be gradually lessened, then I think naturally we're going to get more volatility. And I think for foreign exchange, I think next year we will have a lot more, because I think there's going to be different reactions from central banks. Not all labour markets, again, are created equal, and we will see that coming through into wage inflation pressures, into CPI inflation pressures, and then into the build-up for what different central banks are going to do in terms of coping with inflation or not. So I think we're going to have quite a bit more volatility in foreign exchange in 2022.
And they're pushing me ever further east, Jane. I've left Dubai. I'm in Singapore, so I'm naturally drawn to the Asian FX trade. I'm looking at WCRS on the EM trade. It's interesting. Over the past 5 days, the Asian currencies, the Korean won, the Philippine peso, the Indonesian rupee, and the Thai baht, they didn't. They remain strong in the face of an ascendant dollar. Just lay me out your view on EMFX generally. I know the lira has its own story, the Turkish lira has its own story, but as we drift east, what is my risk?
Well, again, we've got to look at the different stories here about GDP growth, about the different central banks as well, and about COVID risk too. We're looking at the story about semiconductors and output, and some countries have done pretty well in terms of exports over the last year, because, of course, as the US, Europe began to pick up, then exports from many Asian countries did really quite well. I think we can throw Japan into that mix as well. So a weak Japanese print today, but actually, if you go back a year ago, its recovery in terms of exports was a lot sooner than many people thought. So we've got to weigh up on all of these factors and look at Asian EM, I think, from the individual country basis.